Okay, welcome everybody to this session. This is a session led by the British Curriculum Forum. My name is Sarah Selesnyov. I'm a member of BERA Council and also the British Curriculum Forum, and you can find some information about the British Curriculum Forum on our banner to the left. We're really excited to be introducing 4 winners of the British Curriculum Forum grant from 2021 to 22. Each speaker will be presenting and have a little bit of time for questions, and then we have a little bit of time at the end for an open discussion about practitioner research, something very close to my heart as someone who is a head teacher and also a researcher. So very excited about this session, and I'm going to bring up to the mic first Sian Smith and Leon Andrews from Llanwern High School in Wales.
Bore da. I believe we're the only Welsh representatives in this British Curriculum Forum showcase. So forgive us for spending a minute on the national context within Wales. So following consultations in 2020 and 21 on a draft race equality action plan, Welsh Government strengthened and finalised the plan, and that included the language. And moving from race equality to the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan was in direct response to findings and understanding that it would be essential for organisations in Wales to be active in their work for the vision of an anti-racist Wales by 2030 to become a reality. And I think the framing of the language race equality to anti-racist is significant and ambitious, and demonstrates an understanding not seen in Welsh Government before. And many of us will be already familiar with the limitations of the non-racist person who never knowingly or explicitly is racist, but is working within an institutionally racist society or organisation. And it's likened to being a passenger standing still on an airport conveyor belt and thus becoming complicit in a movement towards racism. And what the term anti-racism requires is action and a conscious decision to turn around and to walk into the crowd to disrupt the flow. And I also mention this language change with reference to our research. The amount of learning and pace of learning that's happened for us personally and for the school since we received the BCF grant has been nothing short of momentous. And our use of language and how we frame our actions has evolved alongside this. So who are we? Introductions. I'm the Deputy Head Teacher of Llanwern High School. I've been a teacher for 25 years, and I've taught in London, in Auckland, and Weston-super-Mare. I don't think you were expecting that in the third one. And I'm just about to start a career break to follow up and formalise some of the research that we started with the grant. So I may have to start to charge the BCF for that, for some financial recompense.
Okay. My name's Leon Andrews. I'm a teacher in Llanwern High School where Sian works as well. And as of last week, I'm a senior lecturer and a DARPL outreach teacher at Cardiff Metropolitan University. For those of you that don't know what DARPL is, it's a Welsh Government-funded movement that aims to support practitioners in the start of their journey to becoming anti-racist, professional learning, cultural competency and race relations within education in Wales. In June 2021, you'll see a lovely picture of us up there. Llanwern High was recognised by the National Teaching Awards Cymru by winning the inaugural Betty Campbell Award for promoting the contributions and perspectives of Black, Asian, minority ethnic people. Now, Llanwern is a mixed 11 to 18 comprehensive school in Newport, where historically, it may surprise you, there hasn't been much diversity. Our school at the time of the grant was only 87% pupils identified as being white, which is a stark contrast to sort of a mile down the road where 55% of the students are white. So it's quite a different, not very diverse area. And it's kind of it's this context that is this very white context, including staff, in which I was the only global majority teacher and one of only 3 global majority staff in the whole school. So again, not very diverse. So there was a number of racist incidents that took place after lockdown in Easter 2021, following the global Black Lives Matter movement and the introduction of the new purpose-driven curriculum for Wales that were the drivers for change in our school. A celebration of diversity, we called it at the time, and the BCF grant facilitated many of the actions that we have taken.
So our research question was, can a whole school focus on celebrating diversity reduce the volume of racist incidents? Which, I'm aware now, frames so many complex concepts far too simply, and I suppose hindsight is a wonderful thing. And as you can see by the celebrating diversity phrasing, we were tentative and vague in our language, but I like to think this wasn't the case in our actions. It was a conscious decision to have a celebratory focus in order to engage the heads and hearts of staff and pique the interest of the whole school body, as well as ensuring that all students felt a sense of Cynefin within the school.
So it's crucial when embarking on this work that you consider the context of your own setting. Our community isn't the most affluent. It's not filled with opportunities for the young people. And some of our global majority parents and pupils are subjected to racist language and physical attacks. And having worked in the community for a number of years before I moved to Llanwern, I was kind of acutely aware that if we wanted to win the hearts and minds, we needed to hook people in. And when I say people, I mean the pupils, the parents, the carers, the governors, and the wider community, especially if we truly wanted to make an impact. But again, as one of the very few global majority teachers and a former pupil, I was quite insistent with the senior staff in the school that if they wanted to go about doing this work, it needed to be done in the right way. And it had to be a whole school approach and not a day of staff training or an afternoon or celebration for Diwali or Eid. It needs to be embedded across the whole school in the curriculum, and it needs to be visible throughout the whole school calendar. And there's a term in Wales that's used quite a lot at the moment, Cynefin. It's a Welsh word that doesn't have a direct translation, but it's somewhere between ancestry and belonging. And we needed to we needed to develop really all of our students' feelings of belonging to ensure that they felt that their school was part of their Cynefin. But what was equally important for us was addressing the sort of outdated and stagnant approach that our school had, and many other schools still have when it comes to addressing racism and prejudice effectively and learning about other cultures other than through the European white lens. I don't know if I asked that. I was going to ask you a question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Yeah. So how many of you have read Mice and Men in school? How many of you have had to read that out loud in school? And how many of you have had the whole class turn and look at you when the N-word is said? I suspect that for the final question, not as many. So
in order to address some of these issues, we strategically planned a number of actions that could and would inform our approach. And at the heart of these actions was learner and parent voice. As an exclusively white SLT and an almost exclusively white teaching staff at the time, we knew that we needed to hear from those with lived experience of racism, not only in the community, but the race-related incidents in our school. And we committed to listening for a change, you might want to add. Decades of the colonial power dynamic, even in traditionally left-leaning organisations like schools, has not moved us forward. The listening we did and continue to do is probably the aspect of the research that I am most proud of. and ironically least involved with at the start. Because it's not as easy as one day bringing global majority pupils out of lessons to talk about their experiences of racism. And in our report, you'll see how we took our time and we were careful about the pupils we chose, the reassurances we gave, and the transparency with how the information would be used. We carefully chose the right member of SLT to conduct the interviews, and what we were told about our school, our processes, and our curriculum, as well as how the pupils had modified their own Cynefin to avoid the worst of the racism, was a heartbreaking yet defining moment in our school's journey. Because let's face it, schools need and want to look good. They need bums on seats, they need positive inspection reports, and they need LAs and other interested parties to think everything is progressing and improving. And the fact that our head teacher, Tracy Jarvis, did not look away but leaned in when we revealed what the real experience of our global majority pupils was at our school, and the impact of our narrow colonial curriculum on all of our pupils is nothing short of heroic in my eyes. We're not a leafy middle-class school who can afford to take risks. We serve some of the most deprived estates in Newport. We are undersubscribed, and we'd only just been removed from a nesting category. What our head teacher demonstrated was a bravery and integrity that anti-racist leaders need, but also resonated with the purpose-driven curriculum for Wales. All pupils should be healthy, confident individuals ready to lead fulfilling lives as valued members of society, as well as ethical, informed citizens of Wales and the world.
So a little bit about what we actually did with the money, I suppose, might be interested to know. So from the initial Learner Voice, we moved to a weekly pupil diversity club for the global majority pupils and their allies, which has evolved over the past couple of years from a place where it was just a sort of sounding board, where we were listening to what they wanted. And we had some quick wins from that, such as for reflection rooms during Ramadan and halal stickers being used in the canteen, to now the sort of students being the driving force of the whole school celebrations calendar, which was previously known as the Celebrating Diversity calendar. So again, the omission of the word diversity in year 2 was intentional. So following the success of the calendar in year 1, we wanted everyone to understand that we're not celebrating other people, other communities, but our school community and everyone who's a part of that. So the celebrations calendar included half-termly themes, similar to sort of a primary setting. Within each theme, there would be form time activities. This is where topics that were first presented to the pupils, any competitions we had going were presented to the pupils, that were all linked to the specific themes that we had. We tried to make it as interactive as possible. There was different sort of research tasks, lots of practical challenges. Again, just to try and hook the kids' interest and to pique their interest. There was whole school competitions, and you'll see from some of the pictures here, you'll see some of the student work, from our Freedom Float Parade on the far side, to our migration theme competition, which was a creative arts competition in the top left-hand corner. We had end of theme events, which have ranged from our Taste of Newport International Food Festival, which saw our students ditching the beige diet for sort of Venezuelan pepadillas and vegan tacos, which was, again, really, really successful, and the kids loved it, and also the staff loved it because they got fed. And more recently, the pupils insisted on having a culture fest, which they planned and ran themselves, and you can see that in the top corner there, it was like it was a fashion and talent show, but also they invited parents in, and they did sort of world food cooking classes to all the other pupils. And again, it's about developing that sort of sense of Cynefin for the pupils, and them taking a bit of ownership on what they do in their school. But I think the thing that adds the most value to the celebrations calendar is the fact that in every area of learning experience across the school, there are lessons delivered that are linked to the theme at Key Stage 3 level, and that just amplifies the whole school message again. So if a pupil is maybe not that interested in English or science, they're still getting that message in maths, in technology, in humanities as well. So it's just having a different lens on that, which really hooks the pupils in.
Right, so I'm going to gloss over this part because obviously the detail is in our report and I know we're running out of time. But I just wanted to point out, with regard to professional learning, we were really careful about how we involved staff, which was frustrating but necessary for long-term commitment to making significant changes instead of that danger of ticking boxes. We tried to use Kotler's change principles because they seemed really relevant and also because there are only 4 of them. But it was about involving a select few as well as the diverse many, engendering a have to and want to attitude. We wanted to involve both the head and the heart, and we used the management and leadership tools at our disposal to strengthen our approach. And I guess the summary of findings to our original question: does a whole school approach to celebrating diversity reduce the volume of racist incidents? Is no. In fact, if you measure the number of recorded race-related incidents since we started our work, they've almost doubled. So why do we feel heartened by our work and feel able to stand in front of you today and know that we're having a positive impact? Well, firstly, because the question was too basic. It doesn't recognise the difference between reported incidents and the incidents themselves. You know, and what age do you think global majority pupils first experienced the classic, "I'm sure they didn't mean it like that," by their well-meaning teacher invalidating their response, and their experience, sorry. And how many times do they have to see their predominantly white teachers look of fear when required to talk about race before not bothering to ask questions or ask for help? Because whilst I was initially alarmed by the increase, I understand it now is part of our journey. I think it's increased because our global majority pupils have started to trust us trust that we will handle racist incidents properly. And I also think our teachers have increasing expertise in recognising and dealing with those incidents. Our BCF research has taught us, so much. And if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about DARPL and about some of our collaborations, we will be talking tomorrow on the 6th floor. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much. A really great presentation. Are there any questions from the audience? We have 2 minutes for questions. Any questions from anybody?
Reactions and responses by the community. I don't think you included that. I mean, it may be in the talk tomorrow, but if you've got a moment just to refer to that. Reactions and comments by the community to what you did. It's not mentioned in this. You might be doing it tomorrow, but I just...
So how the community, we've engaged the community, is that what you mean, and how they've reacted to that?
Was there any negative reactions or positive?
No negative reactions at all, but I think it was about the way that we went about it. It was in a really subtle way. It can be quite daunting for some people if things are thrown in their face, and in where we are and where we're based, that would have been the case. Just from being in the community myself a lot, I know what it's like. So it was about sort of drip feeding that in at the start, hooking people in, and then we can start the hard work, and then we can start evolving every year and adding sort of extra bits to it.
Yeah, I think I'd just like to add as well, I think one of the most important things we did was to involve not just the teachers, but the LSAs, the admin, and the site team. So it felt like a culture change. I think it has had an impact because when we started the work in Year 11, there were only 9% of students who identified as being from the global majority. And in each year group now, that's really growing to basically nearly a quarter, isn't it? And I think that parents are starting to trust us with their children.
I was going to ask about what the diversity is now, because you said at the start about being 87%. I wondered, you briefly touched on it, but did you have any pushback from your governing body at all or anything on that? Because I assume, this might be wrong, but I assume they're all white if it was 87%
They were.
white anyway. And
Well, they were all white, and now they're not. You know, by including the community, certainly by doing some lessons for parents, that we have a more representative governing body. It's not good enough yet, so that's made a difference. I know it sounds really shallow, but winning awards like that has made a difference, you know? I feel terrible saying that, but it does make a difference. To be recognised for the work you're doing sort of brings people on board. Anything you want to add?
No, that's good.
Thank you very much to Sean and Leon. Great presentation. Can we give them another clap, please? And the next speaker to come up is Claire Needler from the University of Aberdeen. Thank you very much to Sean and Leon. Great presentation. Can we give them another clap, please? And the next speaker to come up is Claire Needler from the University of Aberdeen.
Yeah, I'm Claire Needler. I'm a PhD student at the University of Aberdeen. I worked in partnership with a teacher called Jamie Fairbairn, and that's him there, but he's in school today, but I've got a video from him embedded in the presentation, so we'll hear from him too. Today I'm sharing findings from our research, and Jamie will talk about the longer term impacts of the work that BERA funded. So I'm from the Elphinstone Institute, which is an institute that researches ethnology, folklore and ethnomusicology. But my background is in adult education and lexicography, and my own research interacts between language, culture and education, and how that creates a sense of belonging. And that's the kind of lens that I brought to this work. And together, we investigated whether teaching the Scots language qualification to predominantly Scots-speaking pupils boosted their self-esteem and encouraged wider achievement. And we used a transformative pedagogical approach that aimed to raise awareness about Scots as a language, raise the status of the Scots in education, and bring about positive attitudinal change. And these approaches could also be used in other minority language educational contexts. We learned a lot from Gaelic, which is one of the other languages in Scotland. And the comic strip is from a research skills booklet that we produced as part of the project. It's written in Scots with input from the pupils, and we used it as a resource for teaching research skills to the pupils. So, what is Scots? It's one of 3 Indigenous languages in Scotland, alongside English and Gaelic. It's a Germanic language that's like a cousin to English. It's not Gaelic, which is a very different language. And it's spoken by 1.5 million people in Scotland, according to the 2011 census. And the map, Banff, it's got 2 Fs, but that's the dark blue bit. That's where my field site was. That's where the school is. And the density of the blue indicates the increasing percentage of Scots speakers. So in the northeast of Scotland, there's more than 50%, around about 50%, self-identified as Scots speakers in the last census. It has a rich literature. It was spoken by all levels of society in lowland Scotland up until the Union of the Crowns in 1603. But over time, English became the dominant language with higher status and a standardised orthography, and was used in education and official life, and Scots became associated with the home and hearth. And in 1872, the Education Scotland Act was passed, which made schooling compulsory, but English the language of instruction. And I've got a quote here from the Scottish Education Department in 1947, which said, "Scots is not the language of educated people anywhere and could not be described as a suitable medium of education or culture. Against such unlovely forms of speech masquerading as Scots, we recommend that schools should wage a planned and unrelenting campaign." So at that time, Scots were stigmatised and pupils were actively discouraged from using it. And some of our contributors talked about being belted, physically punished for speaking Scots as recently as the 1970s. But thankfully, there's been a rapid change in educational policy since the UK government signed the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages in 2001. The Scots Language Award qualification was launched in 2014, And in 2017, Education Scotland said, with its various dialects, Scots forms an integral part of Scotland's heritage and cultural life, playing a vital role in children and young people's learning about Scotland. So that's a really rapid shift. Well, it's not rapid, but it's a really profound shift from 1947 to 2017. And these two quotes here, the first one is from one of the pupils. I didn't even realise it, of course, that it was separate from English growing up. I didn't even realise that Scots was like a separate thing until Banff Academy, because until then it was just the way you spoke. But it's nae just slang, which is what everyone thought it was. And this was something that was surprising to me. Lots of the pupils didn't realise that they spoke Scots until they came to the school, to the secondary school, and this was a kind of consciousness raising that being in a Scots-speaking environment and being part of this research was. And the second quote here is from the head teacher, who said, what's definitely apparent to me from meeting the young people here, that by promoting Scots language, it definitely gives them a sense of identity, it definitely builds confidence, it definitely builds resilience, because they are proud of their language, and the link between success and wider achievement is clear to me. And that was partly about boosting the status of the language within the school, and also pushing the boundaries of the places where Scots language was acceptable, not just in the home and the hearth, but embedded in school life. These photos are taken from a participatory arts project that we used the money for. We hired a professional artist from an organisation called Cage Beastie, and did participatory action research about what the Scots language meant to us. So the photo is the words aren't there. Oops. The photo is a girl holding a bowl of sweeties, which is gulsh in Scots. And I didn't realise that the bottom was cropped off. We partnered with the Scots language dictionaries. And at the bottom of these big poster exhibitions, we've got the word and their dictionary definition, and then an example sentence that the pupils themselves used. And in the workshop, we set up the room like a photography student, and pupils were involved in taking the photos and holding the lighting, and it was really, really interactive and really transformative. The pupils also, we trained them in research methods, and they went out and they recorded interviews, and they spoke to teachers, and they led a whole strand of the research. And one of the pupils said that he would like to be able to write his essays in Scots and take his exams in Scots. And when I took that back to Jamie, the classroom teacher, he said that he would try that out. So he got the Scots language class to translate a lesson on glaciation into Scots, and then taught glaciation in geography in Scots. And that was kind of the start of cross-curricular innovation in the school. And the last bit, transformative pedagogy. We made a commitment to transformative pedagogy, which Vetrano et al. Define as the ethos, process, and approach to learning and education that entails creating spaces where critical questioning of the world is possible. And I think that was what was so amazing about this pupil-led strand of the research. I'd gone in with some ideas, and watching the pupils actively get involved in the change process and becoming aware that they had this extra language that they weren't necessarily aware of before was really, really, really moving. Stop there. So all the recordings from the pupils and my own recordings, ethnographic interviews with the pupils and teachers and support staff and visiting experts, including language activists and authors. I gathered all that stuff together, and the photographs and the sound recordings as we walked around the school. And I used Brown and Clark's six-step process to guide my thematic analysis, and this triangle represents the final themes. And home at the top means the language that pupils bring from home, and there are language attitudes that are formed by early experiences and primary school experiences and family and community. And then when they get to Banff, the secondary school, that's where the change began to happen. And the teaching triangle is one part of the change, where pupils were taught skills, literacy skills mainly, and also develop confidence and self-esteem in using Scots. And then the second triangle, the policy, that's a combination of both kind of top-down legislative change and educational policy change, but also bottom-up activism from the wider Scots language movement, but also from the change that the pupils started in the school themselves. And the classroom in the middle, I've called that the nexus, because that's kind of the centre of the web where the different strands interact. But of course, the school isn't a microcosm. And I use linguistic ethnography, and Angela Crease says that linguistic ethnography is useful because it's a useful framework to look closely and look locally whilst tying observations to broader relations of power and ideology. And that's what I think is going on here. The stuff that happens in the classroom is really powerful, but it's kind of interacting in a web with the wider Scots language activism and policy and educational reform. And now I'm going to hand over to Jamie, hopefully. Right, his video is 10 minutes, so we're just going to watch as much as we can in the time.
Teacher who was researching along with Claire on this project, and I'd like to take you forward and tell you a little bit about what's happened since we had the BERA grant, which I think has really positively influenced how things have gone on the whole issue of Scots language within the classroom and at school. First of all, as Claire has mentioned, that we have seen a massive impact on self-esteem of pupils, particularly those people who are Scots speakers themselves, making up between 50 and 60% of pupils at the school. Also, in terms of literacy, we've found that using Scots as well as English in the school has allowed them another passageway to do literacy and to build up their literacy. In some cases, Scots speakers writing more in Scots than they would in English. And also, in terms of their cultural knowledge of their own place, their own country, their own region, and being able as well to empathise with those people and their cultures in different places around the world and around the rest of the UK. Of course, COVID did affect everybody negatively, particularly it had an effect on pupil health and well-being and equity, but there was an awful lot of good quality work done from home with Scots as well. We found that pupils liked the independence they had for their learning, and when we came back after COVID, we actually wanted to hang on to a bit of that, make sure they had more independence with their own learning. They wanted to do more digital learning, so we were able to develop a website so that home learning could happen at just as good a pace and just as good a level as being in the classroom. We also developed other online resources. But what about the influence of the project on uptake of pupils wanting to study Scots language? At the school that I teach at Banff Academy, it's all done by choice, so you have electives to do Scots. So we're seeing an increase in that now, with senior classes wanting to do the Scots Language Award, perhaps 25, 26, up to 30 pupils wanting to do that. The other great game changer was lower down in the school, at S3, which is 13 to 14-year-olds. So here, at the junior level then, pupils were given the opportunity to choose a language in third year. And they had the choice between French and Scots, as well as being able then to choose another language such as German or Spanish to do as well. Now, what we found was the first time we offered that, we had 2 classes worth of pupils who wanted to do Scots language, study the history and development of the language, the linguistics of it, and do creative things with Scots. As the years have gone on, we're now in our third year of trying that. We now have 4 out of the 7 classes were very interested to do Scots, and so they have a good basis then to have that and be able to progress on to do Scots at the senior level, where they're doing it in a lot more detail. But how have we been able to sustain that increase in uptake and increase in the number of people who are doing Scots and how well they're doing? The secret to that really, I think, has been in terms of collaboration. Obviously, our first collaboration was along with BERA and working with the University of Aberdeen, which was the trigger for this. But since then, we've worked with Education Scotland, the Open University, projects from Glasgow University, such as the Scots Syntax Atlas, working with Scots Radio, Historic Environment Scotland, the Scots Language Centre, the Scottish Qualification Authority, Scots House, which has wonderful resources for Scots for teachers, and companies such as Caged Beastie, who are amazing companies who will work with audio-visual, they work with all kinds of multimedia together with Scots and other subjects as well for community development. So that has been the key. Then we decided to have a collaborative group within the school in order to increase the number of teachers who were able to teach Scots and were qualified to do that. So we set up a collaborative group of teachers from lots of different curricular areas around the school who were interested in Scots language and met every week basically to discuss issues and to talk about how we could incorporate Scots into the curriculum. Then the Open University and Education Scotland were looking for a group to partner to pilot a course, an Open University course, continued professional learning on Scots in order to give people the official recognition that they were Scots teachers through the General Teaching Council of Scotland. So we did that, it took a year, and then those teachers were much more confident and able and qualified to be Scots language teachers within the school, and not just within one subject, but across all the curricular areas of the school. And just to prove that it wasn't just myself who had these views, me and Claire, on our own, but lots and lots of teachers were feeling that Scots needed to be recognised more within the working environment. So here's an example of an English teacher, Miss Hurd, saying that it was extremely important to change the dominant culture of speaking properly to one where pupils use their true voice, embrace their culture and have the ability to speak Scots, their own abilities valued, as it is a big part of themselves and who they are. The use of Scots in the classroom also promotes stronger relationships, she reckoned, with pupils, as it creates a more relaxed learning environment for them to express themselves freely. So here we're seeing almost like an open spread of these ideas around the school, people feeling more confident to be able to express these things. And here's another teacher, Rebecca, a geography teacher at Banff Academy, who felt that a person that speaks Scots and English should be considered bilingual and therefore faces the same challenges and opportunities as other bilingual students. To make classrooms an inclusive place, we must make young people proud of what is, in many cases, their L1, since they're brought up to speak Scots from an early age. So the course was basically an online course, although we did have tutor visits, and certainly we did Zoom calls with tutors on a regular basis. The best bit about it was the forum, where all of the teachers could discuss what they'd learned and what they were learning about. A big chance to go into the academic literature and rummel about to see what they could find out about Scots, as well as their reflections on their practice in the classroom. So an excellent course, took a year, and some of it master's level, so it was level 3 at university, and well worth doing. These teachers now are confident enough to be teaching classes in Scots throughout the school.
I'm just going to stop him there. He goes on to say that the school has been recognised as the Scots School of the Year in 2020, and he has been recognised as Scots Speaker of the Year in an awards ceremony. So the work is continuing and getting really good recognition for what it does. So just to sum up, I'm sorry to cut him short, but just to sum up, the grant was really crucial for the work that had already started. The partnership was already there, but the £5,000 is amazing. We used it to buy in the artist and also pay for my travel and stuff, and as a student that was really, really valuable. And the support that BERA gave as well was great, particularly when we were writing the report. It was, it boosted our own confidence as researchers, and it was really great. And the innovation that we started in 2018 when we won the grant has obviously continued and snowballed and has started more stuff within Banff Academy, but that has rippled out more widely across Scotland. And so, it's got a lasting legacy and continues to grow. So thank you very much.
Thank Thank you so much, Claire. Really, really interesting presentation, especially from someone who really didn't know anything about the Scots language. Do we have any questions from the audience? We have time for maybe a couple of questions.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. And I'm just wondering, I don't know if it's a perfectly formed question, but what lessons we could learn in England, not only children who speak English as an additional language, but children who speak English that isn't accepted by the establishment as proper English.
Absolutely. Jamie's done a lot of work with schools in Northumbria about Northumberland English, and I think there's lessons that could be learned across all different kind of regional dialects actually about just valuing the language you bring to school, and it's not wrong, or if you're told it's wrong then it stops you speaking, and if you're encouraged and valued, and of course there is a place for proper English and academic English and to be able to read and write standard English, but there's nothing, you shouldn't feel ashamed of the way you speak, and I think that would apply to anybody.
And that so-called standard English is a dialect, basically.
Yes, of course it is. Of course it is, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Claire. Could we give Claire another clap, please? Next up, we have Susanna Prabhu-Naik from Long Sands College.
That's right. Thank you. Also, thank you to all of you for being here. We're like second to last presentation of the day. We're still here and not asleep, so well done. I think we all deserve a round of applause. Right, I am Susanna Prabhu-Naik. I am an English teacher at heart, and I work in a school in Cambridgeshire, so about an hour and a half away from here. And I'm here to talk about the curriculum project that I conducted actually last academic year with the funding that we received from BERA. I was looking at focusing on diversifying our narrative voices, the narrative voices that our students hear in school, specifically focusing in on aspects of race and ethnicity. I wanted to know what current perspectives we were presenting to our students. What do our students hear? And I think that those are two slightly different things. So, how did this come about? About 5 years ago, Kai, my Year 9 student, in his end of Year 9 exam, he was asked to write about the purpose of education. Interesting responses from my Year 9 students, but specifically from him. His answer became increasingly angry in its tone as it worked up towards this statement that he made in his exam. And it was, I don't understand the purpose of education that I'm taught, because why do we have to study black slaves and dead rich white kings? And as I was reading this, I was completely taken aback, primarily because it actually hadn't occurred to me as an, I'm going to apologise to you guys because you used a phrase that I hadn't come across before. I'm going to use ethnic minorities, and you called it global majorities. Actually, I really like that, but I'm, for the purpose of not putting me off my presentation, I'm going to go for ethnic minorities, if you don't mind. As an ethnic minority teacher, it had never occurred to me the kind of voices that our students are hearing specifically about race, and that made me incredibly embarrassed. As an English teacher, I'd thought about how women were presented, but not about race. So I began to reflect on the sort of narratives that I had shared with my student, that particular student, that year. And we had done black protest poetry and lynchings with the death of Eric Garner. I don't know if you remember him. We then moved on to Of Mice and Men, another problematic book when it comes to race. And then we moved on to texts where race was completely absent. I began to panic. This is what I was presenting, this particular student. And having done a bit of research through this grant, In Pearson's commission research into diversity and inclusion in schools, they stated that not being able to see yourself or your context reflected in what you learn, or seeing negative portrayals of yourself, which I think is actually worse, can act as a significant barrier to learning. Pupils who have a sense of belonging at schools tend to perform better academically, as well as be happier and more confident. I love the fact that a lot of what I've heard already is resonating with this statement. And I think that the student, Kai, not being able to recognise himself in the curriculum that he was experiencing led to this very angry response that he wrote in his Year 9 exam. Okay, that was one student. I am one teacher, and very much like my colleagues over in Wales, the context that my school have is majority white. If we look at the national average of minority ethnic groups, it's roughly about a third in secondary schools, but at Longsands, at my school, it's under 10%. So it is very small. In terms of English as an additional language, we're looking at about 17% nationally, and at Longsands it is under 5%. With a staff body of about 100 teaching staff, I am one of 2 teachers there. Why would it matter for us as a school to be looking at a curriculum that looks at different narrative voices? And this was a question that I posed to my very white teaching staff. And actually, it made us think that the demographic that we have perhaps leads our students to not have incidental and authentic engagement with cultures and a diverse range of cultures. And this is something that we perhaps needed to orchestrate because they were not being exposed to experiences. They weren't able to increase, I guess, something that we're trying to talk about as their cultural literacy. And at our school, at Longsands, one of our driving principles behind our curriculum is that we are trying to push for a knowledge-rich curriculum. And a curriculum that is both, it's really hard, both broad and balanced. And the DFE, in the wake of COVID, insisted that our recovery curriculum should also maintain a broad and not narrow approach. So why are we talking about a curriculum that is broad and is balanced? Why am I looking at voices that are broad and balanced and not specific? Well, on a very basic level, we wish our students to be critical thinkers. And if they are exposed to multiple voices, then they are able to hear these voices and critique what is their truth, I guess, what they would like to align to, but also see different perspectives. I think for them to be able to contextualize information fosters a better grasp on what perhaps our school would want to call the regular content, though actually I find that term problematic. Beyond that, and actually something that I think is far more important, we wish to be able to make our students to make sense of the world around them. They are not hopefully going to stay in St. Neots for the whole of their life, and they are hopefully going to expose themselves to more than their Indian English teacher in their lives. We want them to become citizens of England, at the very least, but of the world. We want to be able to take them beyond their experience in the classroom. And that is a statement that is on our website. So I want to be living what we preach. I think it is important for me to not portion blame. I think that we are in a context that governs how we approach our curriculum. And when I started doing my research, the Lit in Colour report had just come out, and it made my jaw fall on the floor. because the DFE, examination boards, the viewpoints that our parents and our wider community feel and have shaped by the media as well is very Eurocentric, actually. And this idea that speaking properly is the way forward and how to be successful is something that is drilled into our students. So, being an English teacher, I was actually saddened to know that out of the 500,000 students who take English GCSE literature, a third of them are black or Asian or ethnic, minority ethnic. However, 0.7% of the cohort study a book by a writer of colour at GCSE. Even less than that, 0.1% of students study a book by a woman of colour at GCSE. And then at most 7% of those 500,000 students study a book by a woman at GCSE. Interestingly enough, 85% of those students study an Inspector Calls, which is the modern text. And I don't know if you know, an Inspector Calls, it's not modern. So that is the kind of context that we are working in, and I was really interested to see whether other subjects in our school have these similar sort of biases led by the curricula, led by examination boards. So, what was our project? I got really excited, geekily, when I went to a talk, and it was I was introduced to Lagrange, who is a South African lecturer, and he put together this model on decolonising the curriculum, and he puts it in 5 stages. Seems really simple. It's not really. The first stage is rediscovery and recovery. It is about actually taking a step back and looking at our curriculum. What trajectories, what narratives are we presenting to our students at this moment in time? What do we teach? And after that, looking at our curriculum, looking at it, what we teach, you then enter a stage of mourning. Sounds quite bleak, but actually it does happen. You look at what you are presenting your students and you think, this is a deficit model. And I spent a lot of my time in the research mourning, which was a bit bleak. But we realized that what we were teaching our students was lacking in this multitude of narrative voices. It is important to do the mourning stage because it leads you on to feeling, what can we do to make this situation better? And it makes you want to dream and think about the potentials of what you want to include. So it is a necessary, albeit painful, experience. So that leads you on to dreaming and commitment, rethinking our schemes of work and contextualizing them to make those complexities, to make the relationships that we have with different areas of society, or the way in which texts are placed, to make those complexities explicit. And then 5 is all about curriculum innovation and action. My research focused on the first 2 and then looking towards the 3, and that's where I ended the project. I wanted to stress to my school that what Keele University put in their manifesto, it isn't about stripping away schemes of learning that you already have in place. It isn't about erasing colonial history. I am an English teacher, I think I've said several times, sorry. I love Shakespeare. I love Dickens. Really controversially for this project, I love Kipling. And it isn't about taking away all of that, but it is about rethinking and reimagining how we can place those texts, or how we can place that information alongside a more globally acceptable way of looking at it. So, these are my research questions. what I focused, to make the project more manageable, I focused in on Year 10, English, Business and History. And for the first question, I conducted curriculum audits based on a few that I found through universities, so UCL, the Open University, and also the NEU, the National Union, National Teachers Union. They all have curriculum audits in place, and I drew upon those to form my questions. The second question was looking at interviewing staff and students and heads of departments and listening to what their experiences are of the curriculum. And I interviewed the groups separately, and I started with the sort of lowest tier with the students, so that I could take their responses up to the teachers. I interviewed the teachers, and then I took their responses up to the heads of departments, so that when it came on to number 3, where the dreaming stage of it, I could feed those responses back to those people and say, this is what they're asking for, what would you like to do about it? That was quite exciting. I'm going to skip over this for time, but that was basically what I did. This is what my curriculum audit sort of looked like, and we've got 3 sections of no, there is no evidence there. 2, it's developing. That was kind of a little bit of a get-out clause, to be honest, because this was embarrassing for us as a staff body. It was painful to say, we don't have this in place. So I allowed them to have we are thinking about this and we're trying to look at it in our curriculum, and then embedded. And actually we found, as within the 3 subjects, a lot of what we were ticking was there's no evidence of diversity in our text or in our curricula, or we are thinking about it. Okay, findings. Teachers come out well in our findings. That's one thing that I realised. They are the bridge of what is prescribed, what is given to us, and the experience that students are having in classrooms. They help students navigate unfamiliar content, and they are the ones who induct students into the conversations of mankind, is what we were aiming for. Ultimately, we found that the exam syllabus is limited in its narrative voices. Now, actually, since I did and completed my research, AQA in my subject has come out with a new syllabus, and we are seeing this traction, these ideas gaining traction, and exam syllabuses are changing in what material they are exposing their GCSE students to. But it was limited, and I think it still is. I think potentially even worse than that, if there is a multitude of voices found on the curriculum, the materials used present a very polarized narrative, in that if you are following a very Eurocentric view, it is you are being successful, whereas if you are unsuccessful, if you are following a sort of global East idea, you are unsuccessful in what it is that you are doing. Teachers are the ones who provide the balance and the nuance between what is being delivered and what students encounter in the class. And that is because teachers are able to bring their passions and their interest into the classroom, to be able to bridge that gap and to say, it's not quite as black and white as this. And they are able to introduce material in a sensitive way because they understand and they know their students. And what I really liked was that students desire that more nuanced approach to the curriculum. They also love it when their teachers are able to give that more rounded approach to what it is that they're hearing from the curriculum. And I'm saying this is almost like an easy process. It really isn't. One thing that came out again and again from the interviews was that all three stakeholders, the students, the teachers and the heads of departments, really face significant barriers in able to overcome or get past this very limited narrative that they are experiencing in their curriculum. But despite this, teachers still persevere and still bring a multi-perspective approach to the curriculum. Okay, last slide, I promise. Where to now? We have got this on the school improvement plan in that we are rolling it out to the rest of year 10, and where we can't, where the subjects aren't taught in year 10, we are looking at it in A-level. We are conducting curriculum audits and interviews for each subject. What I'm really excited about is the conversations that are happening and the fact that more and more people are talking about it from a very, I guess, white perspective. We are now considering why this is important in our curriculum. And then these are my references. These are my curriculum audit tools. That's it. Done.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Very, very interesting presentation again. Do we have a couple of questions from the audience for Susanna? Yes?
Really, thank you for your sharing. So I'm just wondering, like, did you also have the opportunities to really kind of investigate the hidden curriculum, or we say, for example, school culture, or sometimes it could be related to even like languages. So, yes. So just wondering, like, do you have some of those?
So I guess the hidden curriculum actually came out through the interviews, and I had the sort of write-up in mind, so I wasn't specifically looking at what was happening outside of the curriculum. But that is one of our next stages. In fact, we have employed I can't remember what their title is. They've got a new fancy title and a new position in school, and they are looking at how to foster a culture within the school that feels more open and inclusive, to reframe this sort of idea. I guess the hidden curriculum for me was about what the teachers are bridging between the curricula that is given via the exam boards and what they wanted their students to experience. So that was a large part of it, but actually, yeah.
There is a gap. So, it's back to the conceptualization of curriculum. So actually, I don't think like the hidden curriculum is out of the curriculum. Just to clarify. So I think it's your research, your action research is wonderful. Yeah, it's just I'm wondering like any future directions. Yeah, thank you so much.
One more question.
What happened to your pupil? Does he know that his comment in his essays kick-started such a important thing for you and for your school?
So he was one of the people who I interviewed. He was one of my students, and we sat down and we had a discussion, and we actually did it with his head of year, because it then led on to quite a wider range of actually things that were happening within the school that he was really unhappy about. And I think it goes when our colleagues from Wales started talking about racist incidents being reported more and more. I think he didn't appreciate that actually what was happening to him was racist. And he never brought it up because he didn't feel he had I don't think he realised. So, he did. And it has been a bit bittersweet, actually, because he started realising more and more things that he hadn't realised before. That wasn't really a happy thing to say.
Thank you ever so much, Susanna. Can we give her another clap, please? And last but not least, we have Ian Cushing from Manchester Metropolitan University.
Yeah, it's been so nice to hear lots of talks about language here, so it's really cool to hear that BERA have been funding work on language and race as well, and that's what my talk is about. So I'm talking here about a project that was part of a wider project around teachers and pushing back against certain quite dominant ideologies about language. Yeah, so I'm presenting work that I did with a couple of teachers from a bigger project, but in particular I'm focusing on the work that I did with a teacher called Mawahib. And Mo isn't able to be here today, she's teaching, but she also wishes to remain anonymised for reasons that will probably become quite clear as I go through the work. So the work is published in a couple of different places, but mostly today I'm talking about an article that's in Race, Ethnicity and Education, which focuses really on these ideas here. So the idea that there's been a whole history of research in England that has shown us that speakers who are racialised as black have long faced various kinds of intersectional discrimination, but particularly around the way that they use language. And that's taken on a kind of new meaning in the last 10 years or so under what is commonly referred to as the so-called What Works agenda. And the What Works agenda is essentially a movement which favours certain types of policy and research, which claims to be evidence-informed, claims to be committed to social justice. And a major concern of that work has been about language. And what I worry about and what I'm troubled about and what me and Mo were wanting to address was how those language-based interventions were getting sold to teachers as a kind of panacea and as a tool for addressing broader structural inequalities. So as part of a wider project on how teachers might push back against those ideologies, I'm focusing on Mo's work, who was attempting in her school to resist ideologies of the so-called word gap. So a very perpetual concept, but essentially boils down to where racialised speakers have their vocabulary framed as harbouring some kind of deficiencies. So here's some fieldwork notes from Mo's school that came out of the project. And Mo was working in a school in northwest London, a large proportion of black Caribbean children and an overrepresentation of white staff. And me and Mo were just chatting to a group of young black boys before a lesson started. And what I noticed that these boys were doing in their language was that they were perfectly capable of displaying like linguistic creativity, these very dexterous linguistic skills. They had this amazing critical meta-knowledge about language. They were using content-specific vocabulary, very technical vocabulary, using complex syntactical arrangements and complex grammatical arrangements. So they had this amazing and vast linguistic repertoire, just like all the children in the school did. Yet the school perceived and heard their language in very different ways to actually how they were actually able to use their language. So the teachers in the school would describe their language as limited, as lazy, etc. The school subscribed to quite heavily those ideologies of the word gap, and those children were subjected to these very decontextualized and very prescriptive scripted lessons in order to try and fix these perceived and supposed defects. But actually those defects didn't exist at all, right? They were just construed and constructed out of these misperceptions about what white teachers and how white teachers were hearing their language. So worrying to us then was how those interventions got framed as part of this What Works narrative, where the school was believing that they were acting in the best interests of those boys and that those interventions would afford them the route to racial and social justice. So what works then? So schools in England are increasingly encouraged to draw on a certain type of very narrow academic research and the so-called evidence base, especially when that gets framed as a means to improve the life chances of marginalised children. And language plays a really big role in this agenda, especially in things around the so-called word gap, which I'll talk about, which begins from the assumption that marginalised children lack that adequate language, and if they modify their language, then that's the path to social justice and the route out of the struggles that they experience. So that's very embedded, very normalised in policy, in Ofsted inspection methodologies, that appears under this seemingly benevolent and seeming kind of guise of social justice, which assumes that social justice can be achieved if marginalised children would simply change their own behaviour. So that's a kind of classic example of what we call deficit perspectives, or victim blaming, and indeed anti-blackness, where problems are located within individuals themselves in a way which leaves those broader patterns and broader structures of inequality untouched and overlooked. It's really important to note then that this isn't just an issue that's being produced by the political right. It's an issue that's being normalised and promoted, especially recently, by the political left. So it's a bipartisan issue. So Voice 21, who frame themselves as a very progressive, very left-leaning educational charity, reproduce and rely on these very same logics. So in 2019, they talk about how entrenched socio-economic equality lies as a result of language, and therefore it's language that needs to be changed to address those socio-economic disadvantages. Peter Hyman, who's the advisor, the education advisor to Keir Starmer and the founder of Voice 21, in this same document is talking about how students aren't speaking in full sentences, and how language-based and oracy-based interventions, in his words here, can kind of take away the rough edges of someone. So deploying language-based interventions as a solution to solve and address those broader structural inequalities. In particular, then, the word gap is a concept that is rooted in academic scholarship from the mid-90s, which is really persistent in how those ideologies about language have become increasingly normalised. So the word gap has its roots in Hart and Risley's book from the mid-90s, and essentially boils down to their claim that high-income white families talk it's telling me to log into something. Talk more frequently and with essentially better vocabulary than low-income black families. So those claims continue to underpin what works vocabulary-based inventions in contemporary education policy as normalised by popular teacher textbooks like Alex Quigley and Isabel Beck, but also academic scholarship such as that produced by the Oxford Language Report, the recent APBG group on oracy, etc. So there's lots of critiques around the word gap that shows how it's grounded in deficit-based thinking. But Mo's school has subscribed to those logics and subjected those boys that I talked about earlier with this belief that this would somehow afford them that route out of racial injustice that they were experiencing. So Mo wanted to push back against those and had her role as a new literacy coordinator, and that was what her work was centred on, in trying to push back and challenge and reject and resist some of those very dominant ideologies about language that the school was increasingly subscribing to. So Mo was an absolute expert, right? She had an MA in English and Education. She was part of a UK teacher network that me and a colleague were running on critical linguistics, where we read and came together and discussed work on race and class and language stigma. Me and Mo did a whole bunch of things together to kind of learn that longer history about anti-black linguistic racism in England. We went to Finsbury Park and Brixton to certain archives to do that historical work. So she'd made a real commitment to anti-racist practice in her work, drawing on what she saw to be the best available evidence and what she saw to be the kind of evidence that she and her students needed and required in order to have their language practices validated rather than stigmatized, as she saw that the school was doing. So she was really responding to what we drew upon in terms of these very institutionalized ideologies of languagelessness. So here's an extract from an interview from Mo's head of department, where she's kind of justifying why they've brought in these interventions around the word gap. So she's framing low-income black students as not having that language, not having the right kind, things that are missing, things that are limited. The idea that they come from this home life where they're not being exposed to this kind of rich language. I asked her how she knew that. She'd never been to their home. She didn't know this, but she just had this assumption. And then framing that in terms of that being grounded in evidence, so citing academic scholarship in order to support those deficit perspectives. So black and working class children in that school got framed as lacking, deficient, and in need of some kind of individualized remediation in order to try and fix these supposed defects that simply weren't there, but being deployed under this guise of scientific objectivity, of evidence, of social justice, in these really kind of helping hand logics. So Mo's school had these broader institutional subscriptions to the word gap. It had been highlighted in a recent Ofsted report, where Ofsted had perceived the language of children in the school as being ungrammatical, inarticulate, etc., which is totally consistent with how the inspectorate frame marginalised children's language more broadly, such as my collaborations with Julia Snell have shown. And that was the thing that really prompted the school to invest in these vocabulary-based interventions that were marketed as what works, as evidence-based, etc. So they did things like this. They trained all staff to kind of spot and listen out for these vocabulary gaps in students' language, despite the fact that those vocabulary gaps simply weren't there. So here's as an example from some staff training materials where staff are being told to kind of watch out and listen out for these perceived signs of vocabulary difficulties. So students simply hesitating, using general or basic words, students feeling that they couldn't that they didn't want to speak in class. Those kinds of perceptions were being framed to further frame those students as displaying those linguistic deficiencies. They put up things like this on classroom walls. So here's an example of what they call the graveyard of diseased vocabulary, where so-called basic words like happy or sad or hot, etc., were banned and consigned to this graveyard because they weren't deemed to be academic or proper or adequate enough for the classroom. And those kind of words were very heavily handed policed in lots of classroom observations that I saw. So to push back against this, Mo wanted to really reframe the literacy policy that she had that privilege of being able to do as the literacy lead. So she decided to take the exact approach that the school had took in terms of it being evidence-based, in drawing upon research in anti-black linguistic racism and transformative linguistic justice, to basically try and reshape and kind of reclaim that narrative in the school around what was constituting what working. So here's the section of the first draft of the literacy policy that she shared with senior management, where she explicitly rejects that existence of the word gap. She rejects the deficit and racist perceptions about language that she felt management were espousing. She talks about the fact that if a gap does exist, then it's not to do with the students, but it's in how teachers are misperceiving and not listening correctly to their students' language. She connects linguistic discrimination with anti-racist work more broadly, and she talks explicitly about how teachers have that disproportionate power, and that the way that teachers perceive language is perhaps the problem, rather than what students are doing with their language being the problem. It might not surprise you that management didn't like at all this policy, right? So when she presented it in a meeting to management, she was met with lots of anxieties from management, leading to this very heavy-handed policing of her own language and a very heavy-handed censoring of the policy, despite the fact that this policy was indeed informed by transformative social justice principles and indeed what works for her own black students that indeed Mawahib came from the same community from. So she was using that exact same narrative, yet the management of the school rejected it because it didn't conform to those normative ideologies. So in the end, management heavily drafted the literacy policy and deployed this very sanitized version that Mawahib was really disappointed with. So it includes things like, well, yes, staff should make up their own minds about these things. They should visit the CPD library. The problem being, of course, that in the CPD library, there was only those books espousing very normative and very problematic ideologies about language in there. So Mo was really disappointed about this. It was really kind of a barrier that she faced in doing this kind of anti-racist work, really frustrated with management. So in an interview with me in June 21, she said, well, it was pretty clear that management were just using the quickest and the cheapest way of trying to fix those kids' language, even though I knew that what was the problem wasn't actually in their language, but how the school was seeing or indeed hearing their language. The school had just kind of lapped up very uncritically these narratives and rhetoric around the word gap and those ideologies of linguistic defects, without even beginning to consider or listen properly to what those children could actually do with their language. So she took what Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores describe as a ratio-linguistic perspective. And a ratio-linguistic perspective says, well, actually, the problem at all isn't the marginalised speaker. The problem is how those in power perceive and listen to marginalised children. So she attempted to shift this critical analytical attention away from the stigmatised speaker and towards those very institutionalised, very deeply embedded normative ideologies about language, which frame certain speakers as displaying linguistic deficiencies. So in taking that kind of perspective, we can begin to interrogate those pernicious systems which produce inequalities, as opposed to simply relocating and insisting that the victim is to blame for those perceived shortcomings. So in pushing back against this what works agenda more broadly, we came to the conclusion that we want to be really, really clear in how future work and how future critical work with language might begin to have some kind of success. So we're much less concerned with individual teachers and individual schools, of course, and that's not been my intention today to be overly critical of that single institution. Instead, we should direct our criticisms towards the following. So number one, we should direct criticisms towards academic scholarship itself, which makes that universalist claims about language and the culture, purported linguistic and cultural deficiencies of racialized children. So academic scholarship such as grounded in the word gap, for example. We should also be critical of theories of language which draw very crude and very unrealistic and very unhelpful dichotomies between what marginalised children can do with their language and what privileged children do with their language. Thirdly, we should be very critical of mainstream, very reductive, very narrow conceptualizations of what works research, which often posit that modest and language-based reforms and tweaks provide that route to social justice and mobility in a way that simply leaves the broader structural reasons for inequality intact and overlooked. And finally, we should be very critical of both the political left and the political right in how they reproduce and normalise those messages about language and race and social justice. And as we potentially move towards a government that claims to be on the left, that message is perhaps particularly important for future years and for future efforts in doing more critical language work and critical linguistic work in schools. So thanks again to BERA for funding this. There was also a little bit of funding from the British Association of Applied Linguistics that's fed into this project. The small grant is a brilliant scheme, so if there's people here in the room that are interested in doing some kind of small research, then I can really recommend applying for that scheme. It's been really useful for me and Mo, and thanks of course to Mo, and I hope you can understand why she chose to remain anonymous within this study and have her identity protected. But she was so important in doing this work and so brave in pushing back against what she felt to be very harmful ideologies. So when you give a round of applause if you want to, it's not just for me, it's for Mo. Thanks so much. Look at that timing.
Perfect timing. Thanks so much, Ian. Do we have a couple of questions from the audience for Ian? Any questions?
The Scots experience with your description, because if you'd have done that, then you'd have spent all your energy stopping children speaking Scots. Yeah, and this assumption seems to be the way to teach is to stop kids doing something rather than to build on their skills and allow them to express themselves. And I think you said in Claire in your school also learn English and academic English as well as your own expression. There seems to be an assumption in the school leadership that you don't have a choice and you have to stop one thing before you can start another. I don't know if that was your experience or whether that was ever part of the thinking in the school, that there are actually other choices that can be made that can achieve the kind of progress that people want to see, which is, self-expression and identity, but also future success and hopefully influencing and changing the world because of that.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't quite follow the question, but if I understood it correctly, and apologies if I didn't. On the one hand, what was interesting to me was that the school were making these claims around social justice and social mobility, etc. They were often getting the two confused, like social justice and social mobility, that they don't necessarily mean the same thing, right? So they were using that kind of language, but they were assuming that marginalised children might experience social justice by making those minor tweaks to their language and what they were doing with their language, right?
Yeah.
But that isn't a route to social justice at all,
No.
because it just misses off a whole load of other reasons why those marginalised children might be marginalised in the first place. So it's a very tempting logic, but it's a very overly pragmatic and very reductive approach to social justice. And what's really important, I think, is that school certainly didn't invent that theory of change, right? It wasn't just Mawahib's school that were relying on that theory of change. Because that theory of change about language and social justice is deeply embedded within current policy. It's been deeply embedded within current policy for decades. And worryingly, it appears to be deeply embedded already in Labour's new manifesto for education when they talk about oracy, for example, being this route to social justice that marginalised children. Keir Starmer talks about shattering the class ceiling, working class kids requiring oracy. So there's a real tension there with how schools are using that language, but still relying on very deficit logics in a way that I find deeply troubling, and I think one should be called out in advance of a potential Labour government in the next couple of years especially.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to draw us to a close now. A big, huge thank you to all of our presenters. Clearly made great use of the grant. And as Ian said, there are more grants available all the time from the British Curriculum Forum, so do check out the BERA website if that's something you might be interested in. Thank you very much for watching. Can we give all our speakers a big clap once again?